Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Steen Oosterlink. I'm an urban sociologist at the University of Antwerp and the chair of the Urban Studies Institute. And on behalf of Stadsforum and the Antwerp Urban Studies Institute, as well as the KU Leuven and WG Film, if I pronounce that right,
Okay, good evening,
we are very
everybody.
happy to
My
welcome
name
you
is
to the
Steen
aftertalk of
Oosterlink.
the
I'm an
documentary
urban sociologist
Push.
at the University of Antwerp.
The documentary that we will be discussing this evening is a documentary about housing and the way in which the global financial institutions have been entering the housing market in different parts of the world. It's an award-winning documentary, so we're very happy that tonight we've been able to screen documentary. At least you have been able at home to screen a documentary, and we've been able to organize the after talk about the documentary this evening. Let's move to the next slide. As said, the evening is organized in Stadsforum, and Stadsforum is a center for dialogue about the city of tomorrow. And they will be hosting, they have already been hosting, and they will be hosting in the coming months a lot of events about urgent urban issues, such as the financialization of the housing sector. And if you want to know more, you can see the website address on your screen right now, stadsforum.be. Next slide. Before we start the after talk, let's first have a brief overview of the program of tonight. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, so we're sure it's going to be a very interesting talk this evening. First, we were very happy that the director of the documentary Push could be here with us, Frederik Herten. Very much welcome here. We really are looking forward to hear your considerations in making this documentary. So we'll start with a dialogue with you. After that, we have Manuel Albers from the KU Leuven. I will present people in more detail when we come to their part of the program, but Manuel Albers will be able to explain to us all the intricacies of the financialization of the housing market. And we will also, when we enter into debate with Manuel, we'll also very happy to hear the views of Professor Anne Verhetsel. Anne Verhetsel from the University of Antwerp, who has a lot of insights in the real estate market in Belgium, at least the actors that are active in this market. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Line Algoed from the Free University of Brussels, who has a lot of practical but also academic research experience with struggles about land and about specifically community land trusts, where she's the co-author of a recently published book on Common Ground, which really deals with these international experiences of the community land trust. And we are going to be talking with her about the question whether community land trusts can be an alternative to the financialization of the housing market. So let us start, and let me first give you a brief introduction to Frederik Herten, who is, as I already said, he's the director of this documentary, and he's also a journalist, and he's based in Malmö in Sweden. He's the owner, but also the manager and the director in the film company WG Film. I hope I pronounced that correctly, and you can correct me later on. And he's been making quite a few documentaries, amongst which Bikers versus Cars and many more. And you can see at the website of WG Film for more documentary. And we're very happy that he's here with us today to discuss the reasons and the effects of the documentary which he's making and is currently showing around the world. But before we talk to him, let us first see a trailer which introduces a little bit the movie to you. I'm sure most of you have been looking at the movie beforehand, but that gives you a little taste again about what the documentary is about. Let's look at the short trailer.
You know, the first sign that you're gonna have to leave your neighborhood is when vintage clothing shops show up. Then the housing value is gonna go up, and then they're all gonna get the push.
In the Greater Toronto area of the last 30 years, housing prices have increased by 425%.
Then we start asking, who's gonna live in cities? Who are cities for?
They wanna raise the rent up to like $900 each. If it goes to $3,400, then I have to make at least $100,000 a year.
I've seen the whole area change. They start buying up properties because it's a fantastic investment for them.
When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is if only. It's much deeper than that.
owning the house is only a means to making money.
New owners have taken over. We haven't met them, we haven't seen them, we don't know anything about them. It could be Frosty the Snowman for all I know.
I heard one of the councillors said, if you can't live in Notting Hill, then you shouldn't be in Notting Hill. Who the fuck is he to say something like that?
I can stand in the middle of the street and no traffic coming.
Paradisi fiscali sono il luogo dove capitalismo legale si incontrano.
Gold is not a human right. Housing is. We need to reclaim the fundamental right to housing.
Okay, the trailer already gives us quite a good insight into what the movie and documentary is about. It's a very interesting documentary. I think everybody would agree with that. But let's first discuss a little bit more about your reasons, Frederik, for making this movie. And let me pick up on the quote that Sasha Sassen in the trailer already referred to. She's saying, this is not just gentrification. This is something much more foundational. This is something much more important. And on the website introducing the movie, you write that gentrification talk is a little bit divisive. It divides people. It really pinpoints people and blames them for changing in the neighborhood. And one of the reasons why you made the movie was because you wanted to have a better conversation about how neighborhoods are changing. So I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit more on that. What kind of better conversation do you want on changes in the neighborhood that we see in this movie?
Well, hi everybody. I mean, the film is it's a journey trying to understand what's going on and to understand. I mean, we can all feel that there is a lot of powerful things going on out there, but so we're trying to get a little bit closer to understand it, and I think this gentrification word it's been used in a very sloppy way over many years now. It's like the label you can put on something, but it doesn't really help us to understand anything. And I mean, I live in a neighborhood here in Malmö, which is like a classical working class area with a lot of immigrants and so on. And I, in some way, I was a part of a community group who was fighting, drug dealing, or we wanted a place for our kids. And being active in a neighborhood, you are a part of creating gentrification in some way. In my previous film, Bike versus Cars, if you fight for a greener city, more sustainable city, you're also partly pushing it towards towards gentrification, So I think we want active citizens, we want people, we want greener cities, we want cities for all. So it's a little bit more broaden the thing of talking about sustainable cities. They should also be socially sustainable. And we have to understand who are the powers. I mean, if I look around in this neighborhood, the houses are exactly the same ones. But I can see when I look around that global money has entered also into this area. And when global money enters, mainly pension funds, but it's also the Blackstones and whatever you call them, they're asking for a return, quite a big return every year. And of course, that's driving up the rents, not only for us in our homes, but also for the shops, the restaurants, and everything. It makes our life more expensive. So, and this is happening everywhere. So from the outside, it looks the same. The city looks the same, but the ownership of our cities have shifted. And this is a global story. And that's what I really want to talk about.
Okay, so you want to bring other actors into the debate to make them visible in the neighborhood change. And the way, let's talk about the way you were trying to tell this story. You're following
Leilani
Farha. Sorry, I was looking at my papers here. So you decided to follow her. Why didn't you follow the property investors? Why didn't you choose to follow residents? Why did you decide to focus on to tell the story through her going along to all these different places?
If you also watch my previous film, Bike versus Cars, in some way, if you zoom up little bit. I mean, if you come back from this outer space to the planet Earth and you look down and you see all these highways floating around, you know, and you see people waiting in lines with traffic and say, oh, what is this? Where have I landed? You know, it's like it's very strange how the traffic is organized, for example. So sometimes if you zoom up, you can see a new pattern. And I thought that if we want to understand the boring word housing politics, you have to zoom up, because if you go down to the national levels, you end up in a lot of stories, a lot of old institutions, old legislations, old stories, and they differ from country to country. It's a lot of name dropping. It's very hard to make, to tell that story, because we drown in detail. So I really believed on zooming up, and zooming up to a global level. And to see a global pattern, you need global actors or global advocates like Leilani Farha. She has a global perspective. But also remember that you saw Saskia Sassen in the trailer. She has also a global perspective. Joseph Stiglitz also has a global perspective. Also Roberto Saviano. So I mean, with help of these people, I try to see it a little bit from above. And I think, I now know, since this film has been out for a while, that this global perspective makes it easier to recognize things also in your own town. So even if I haven't filmed in Belgium, you can still use this film to talk about what's happening in your own city. And I've been with this in Mexico and Moscow, in Kuala Lumpur, in all over Europe, in South Africa or in Latin America. People are using this film to talk about what happens in their own town. So, and I think that's the global take, the global pattern is the story that can make us talk about things in a new way. And this is like, media is quite often a local outlet, a local national perspective. So there is a little bit of a lack of this kind of the global takes. And I mean, that also goes to many of the academics works also, and that's really important, work on the local studies. So what you do with this panel is actually exactly what I want us to do, to lift it a little bit up and talk from the global perspective.
Yeah, very interesting. We'll certainly get to the local perspectives when we hear Anne and Manuel talking about financialization, and we certainly talk about Belgium as well. But let us first stick with the global perspective. That transpires very well through your documentary, so that's very well done. But I was wondering, at a certain point, we see Leilani trying to make contact with Blackstone, which is one of the big global financial investors. And she didn't get to talk to them, although she does have some kind of an important position with the United Nations. Would that also have been the problem for you if you wanted to tell the story through these global financial investors? Would you get entry to their world? Would you get to see how they think? Would you get to follow them in the same way?
No, but and you know that, because I mean, every powerful entity in the world right now has an army of communication officers, and they communicate. I mean, the president of the US communicates with a tweet. I mean, it's a talk to the press, talk to documentary filmmakers is something they don't do any longer. It's like it's over. It's long time over. And on the other side, if I had reached Blackstone to talk to them, what do you think they would have told me? I mean, I could as well read a web page. It would be slick, nice words. So it's. Unfortunately, that's a challenge for all of us who want to tell stories, also about the powerful, is that they don't really want to talk. And I mean, Blackstone will not even tell you where they are operating, what they're doing. I mean, it's like it's a secret word. I think even for the asset manager at the big pension funds who make deals who buy into Blackstone products, they don't know exactly what they're buying into. They don't know where the homes are, because they're buying into big packages of stuff, so the transparency is very low.
Okay, that's certainly something that we can take up further in the debate. This refusal to talk, of course, is part of the problem, I guess. But let's first look at. We can discuss about the effects of your documentary just in a minute. But let's first look at Leilani Farha. We have a clip ready, and if Jan can put it up, then we get to see her.
I'm Leilani Farha. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing.
Cities are becoming the playground for the rich.
It seemed like an obvious way to be able to do more with my work than I could do on my own. Film gives very abstract and complex material a very sharp and clear depiction. So that's a huge step in the work, because we have to get people to understand that what's happening is unjust, unfair, and a violation of human rights. So if we can sort of show that millions of people around the world do care about this, then I think we're moving forward. And the film will be really instrumental in that, because it's a mobilizing tool.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll be discussing the work that Leilani is trying to do now that she's no longer the Commissioner of the United Nations. But let's first discuss a little bit about the effects that the movie has. We see announcement of screenings all across the globe. So this documentary is really making a lot of views, creating an audience for itself. And I'm wondering, do you have any insight already on the effect that it's generating? Because it's clear that you want to generate some visibility for this problem, that you probably hope that something will be changed. What kind of effects can we already see?
Yeah, I mean, that's like the challenge of everybody. You know, it's like, how can you prove the change you are making? You know, I believe that the change happens within the audience when they see a film and they see new, they understand new relations in the world, and maybe they get the inspiration to do something. But I think, I mean, we had our world premiere in Copenhagen. So that interview with Leilani was actually from March 2019 in Copenhagen, and that was like 3 or 4 weeks before the elections in Denmark. And the festival had invited a lot of Blackstone people, I mean, tenants who lived in Blackstone houses, to the screenings, and there was really intense feeling in the audience. And there was also debate, the second screening, with the then housing minister and other people. So it was a big thing. And so the film has really been instrumental in Denmark. So that matter, so the 1st of July this year, Denmark took a new legislation, and they call it Lex Blackstone. So in that sense, the film has really been important in Denmark. And of course, it's not only the film, it's the active people, you know, the active tenants, the politicians, people who try to do something. Also in Berlin, the film has been playing a lot in Berlin. And also there we have a new legislation. The same we go to Spain, and the film has been playing a lot. But of course, it's also because there are really active movements. But what I can see and hear around the world is that activists are taking up Leilani's language. And that's this basic, really easy sentence: housing is a human right. And you didn't see that before. It's clear. I mean, it is a part of the international human rights legislation, but not even the human rights world, the NGO world, didn't know about this. That this basic right to a home is actually something all nations have signed on to. So I think that language shift has been really important in the debate. And I can see that it's coming all over the US, all over Canada, also Latin America and Asia. I can see people are using this language in a new way. And I think language is important if you want to change something. We should remember that the powerful, the big business, they have been investing in language for a long time. You know, investing in lobbyists, in think tanks, in, you know, all this to create a language, to create explanation models, to why we have to go this way and not this way. That's how they've been conquering the world, basically. So I think if you want to fight back, you do it with knowledge, of course, and that's what all of you represent here, but also with a clear language. And I think the success of Leilani is her her ability to speak clearly. She gets through, and I think that's it's not that easy always. Academics have a tendency to get lost in many details, and people stop listening. I'm not offending anyone, but I mean, so we need somebody who can speak like Leilani.
Okay, we'll see about the latter in the remaining hour of this after talk. But let's first talk a little bit more about the end of the movie, where we see Leilani establishing a kind of a new NGO, which is called Making the Shift. So she's definitely not going to leave this issue alone, and she's going to push on. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Make the Shift is trying to do, and how people that are, touched by your film or made angry by your film, how they can get involved into making this shift? And
so, Stein, I'm going to correct you first. Two things. It's Leilani. No, it's good to know, because she is an important personality, and it's called The Shift. But you're right, because the website is maketheshift.org. It's not easy. I'm just making a little bit fun here, but so Leilani left the UN. It was a 6-year tenure she was on in 1st of May this year, in the midst of the pandemic. And now there is another special rapporteur taking over. That's how the UN system works. But so the shift that you see born here in Barcelona in the film, and the second meeting was in New York, where we also attended, is now growing, and she's now building a little group around her, and they are really active. I mean, you can imagine during the pandemic that Leilani has been into daily Zoom calls with governments and cities around the world about how to fight the pandemic. This very thing, wash your hands, stay at home. How do you do when you people sleeping in the streets, like, for example? So, I mean, with this kind of house the homeless now, which has actually happened in a few places, even if they kicked them out again in the summer. But I mean, so she's been really, really, really active, and she stays active. Actually, this week, the Shift is having their first official mission. So they're actually in Argentina this week, in Buenos Aires. They can't travel, so they have people out with cameras, but they're actually walking into people's home, checking out the conditions and so on. And I will be in a panel like this one with Argentina in a few days. So they're really active, and they are making a change. And it is, I mean, of course, most legislation is on the national levels, and it's harder to move them. But cities are really sitting with this. They're really into these problems are up in their face. So they are really interested to talk to Leilani and to become members of the Shift. And I think there is already some Belgium city, member city of the Shift. I don't think it's Antwerp, but it's
it won't be.
I think it's maybe Ghent, or maybe. So Ghent, but I mean, so it's happening. But I mean, it's not an organization with tons of money and so, and it's still something that is growing a lot from under, and she don't really want to build a traditional NGO. So, but you just check it out. Go to maketheshift.org and check it out. Me and Leilani, we keep talking. So we actually now, in the midst of the pandemic, started a podcast which we call Pushback Talks. You can find it on all the platforms where you can see where you find podcasts, and we have done actually 22 episodes up to now. So where we kind of deepen and update stories from the film, aspects of the film, and we also revisit people who we met in the film, but we also meet new people who can tell us stories. This week, we were in Berlin, talked to Florian Schmidt, the councillor from Kreuzberg, Friedrichshain, and the week before we were a housing activist in Barcelona. And coming this week, end of this week, we were visiting a radio station in Nigeria, Port Harcourt, where people are fighting eviction. So we fly around from our home offices. We zoom out and zoom in. So we're quite active. So please follow the podcast. And if you have questions to me or Leilani, just find us on Twitter. That's the best place to find us and talk to us. And also, I mean, I think, you know, my film, I'm happy when, for example, this evening, and I'm happy when people use the film in their document, their understanding of their own cities. And I really believe in inspiration. And I believe that if we can keep inspiring each other, we can make a hell of a difference. So I think the work you do will also inspire people in other places to do the same, and so on. And so, and I mean, I spend some time on Twitter, and I find a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of stupid things going on out there, but if you filter well, you can actually find a lot of people doing cool stuff. And I think that will make it easier to keep going also, because I think we should all try to stay focused and stay away from all the stupid things, all the noise out there, and focus on the important stuff.
Thank you, Frederick. I think there's certainly much more to watch and listen to, especially the podcast is highly recommended. It's very interesting stuff for all of us. Thank you for being with us, Frederick. I understood that it was not possible for you to stay for the whole evening, but of course,
I will unmute myself and I will listen to you if that's okay.
No, of course, you're most welcome to do so, and please feel free to intervene if you feel necessary. Let's move on to the second part of this evening, and let's move on to Manuel and Anne, who will bring this home, who will bring this to your local situation, but then also try to explain to you what exactly financialization is, because it's one thing to say we should move from gentrification to financialization, but definitely gentrification is, at least in my understanding, a little bit easier to explain than financialization. But before we watch a little trailer in which financialization is explained, let's first present our next two guests in a little bit more detail. First, we have Manuel Albers from the KU Leuven. He's the guy who's definitely a geographer because he's in front of a map. And he's a professor, associate professor in social and economic geography at the KU Leuven. He has a background not just in geography, but in sociology and urban planning. All that is relevant, of course, to understanding changes in the city. He's been working in a lot of different places, University of Amsterdam, Columbia, and so on. So he's been around. And most importantly, he is actually the coordinator of a very, very important project on financialization. It's the REFCOM project. It's the real estate financial complex project, and that's a whole group of people, and actually quite a large group of people who have been analyzing financialization in a lot of different sectors around the world. So he's certainly the right person to explain to us what financialization is. And secondly, we have Anne Verhetzel from the University of Antwerp. She's a full professor in economic geography in the Department of Economics, if I'm not mistaken. She's also involved in the Antwerp Urban Studies Institute. And most importantly, at least for tonight, she is the academic director of the Master in Real Estate, which is a master that has been running for more than 25 years, I believe. And of course, by running this master, she has definitely a good insight in what people in the real estate sector, what they talk about, how do they perceive the world. So we're really looking forward to hear from her how they would look at the issues discussed here in these movies. And Anne is also the chair of the board of directors from the VRP, which is the Flemish Association of Spatial Planners, which of course is also a very important profession in all of these issues. But before we move to Manuel and later on to Anne, let's first show a clip. And Jan is certainly getting ready to put the clip on financialization.
London has, rather ironically, become the money laundering capital of the world. We're a very attractive place for people to put criminal money, particularly in residential property, which in London now is so expensive that most ordinary people from London can't afford to live here anymore. And I think it's really important when we talk about crime, what we mean. We're not talking about bank robbers or burglars. We're talking about highly wealthy individuals who've often obtained their money through corruption or bribery or tax fraud on a pretty massive scale. And that money then comes to London and is used to buy properties. So you've got your house in Kensington here that's now being sold for, say, 15 or 16 million pounds. It's not actually that big a house, in fact. You'd be surprised how small it is. It's actually being bought by a company in the British Virgin Islands. This company in the British Virgin Islands will be owned by another company in the Cayman Islands. But you often find there's a third vehicle in yet another jurisdiction, another tax haven, that owns the second company and the first company that owns the house. So if you are looking at this from the outside, the first question is, who owns this property? And to find out who the human beings are behind the owner of this property is extremely difficult. And if you cycle along the Thames, as I do quite frequently, what you see now are acres and acres of flats all the way along the Thames, from Hammersmith right through the city. What you find is that most of those properties are owned by foreign owners, and a lot of them are empty. And there's no reason why corporations should really own houses, apart from the fact that there's a secrecy trying to be created. It's not just about who owns the property, but where did the money come from? The point is that the professionals in London themselves are setting up this arrangement for the very wealthy foreign person who comes here to buy this house. And all sorts of people benefit from that. Estate agents rub their hands with glee because they will be taking a percentage cut, of course, on these transactions. Lawyers, solicitors, professionals make very significant profits. So there's a sort of payout, if you like.
Okay, this trailer already gives us a first insight into what exactly financialization is, but to really know what it means, let's move on to Manuel, who will be giving a short presentation of around 15 minutes, and he will be trying to explain to us what exactly financialization is before we enter into a little bit more debate. Manuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stein. Do you see my screen with the title Game of Homes? Okay, I see on nodding, so I'll take that as a yes. Okay, good. Stein, thanks a lot for the invite. It's great to be here talking about this movie. I was very excited for this movie to come out. I participated in the crowdfunding of the movie. And I've also been talking to Leilani quite a bit over the years that she worked as the UN Rapporteur. And she invited me also to come to Geneva and talk to the UN, which was quite an interesting event to see how these things take place for someone who never goes to these kind of events. And some of the slides I show you are actually some of the slides I was showing at the UN as well. So here you see the title. You also see to the left the book, part of the presentation I do based on this book that is on the financialization of housing. So deals very much with a lot of the topics that are also being discussed in the movie, and also discusses this through a number of different countries. So here I've gathered a number of just little pictures about financialization and housing. When I started writing about this in 2008, people thought it was a very odd term, and especially applied to housing, and they didn't really understand it. And this has changed quite a bit in the meantime. And you see in the top two things referring to the work of Leilani and the report she has written. And the piece on the right, I think, is from The Guardian, where it's actually mentioned that she's writing this letter to Blackstone Group. But also to the bottom left, you also see a report from an action group, a number of activists that are working throughout Europe who've also written a report on these matters. So it actually creates a language to talk about these issues. And I think the film definitely helps in this. But we see that even policy institutions are also picking up on this. So not just the UN through the work of Leilani, but also here at the bottom right, you see a joint workshop of the European Commission and the City of Amsterdam called EU Cities in the Financialization of the Housing Market. So within, by academic terms, a relatively short period of time, a lot of these things are being picked up. The things I show you here are all from the last 3-4 years. So this is a slide that I often start with when I get to the content part. Whether I'm in Belgium or whether I'm somewhere else, I often start with this slide because it shows so well what is happening to many places around the world. I took a very basic picture from Elise Romainville, who did her PhD at the ULB, that's one of the universities in Brussels. And what she shows in the picture, if you just look at the bottom line, these little crosses, they're index numbers, and they basically show average household income in Brussels is more or less stable. It goes up a little bit, then down a little bit, stabilizes again. But the differences are relatively small there. If on the other hand, you look at the other line, which at some point is going up quite steeply, those are the average housing prices. And they also start at 100 because these are index numbers. And you see for the first 7 or 8 years or so, basically they stay stable and income and housing prices develop together. Then you see something starts happening in the early 2000s and housing prices go up a lot and they stabilize basically around 200. That means that over the periods of only about 5 or 6 years, the housing prices double, while actually the income levels don't double. And although the timing of this is quite specific to Brussels, not even to Belgium, but to Brussels, we see this picture all over the world. Housing prices rises, but income levels remaining stable, in some places going up a little bit. And this happens in most cities around the globe. I'm not saying it happens everywhere around the globe, but I'm sure that it happens in more than 90%, so not 19, but 90% of the cities around the world. And the same is partially true for rent prices, although it's a bit more complicated there, because in some places these are heavily regulated, so they can't always go up as much as we see. And then push versus Belgium a little bit. I think it's important to understand some of the things that are being discussed in the movie are a bit different in Belgium. So I'll start with that and I'll end with that as well. I think it's important here to highlight that Push mixes two stories, which I think are both important, but sometimes I think it can be a bit confusing in the movie which story we're listening to, because they're mixed in a certain way that they seem to be one big story. And the one big story is like, yes, it becomes harder to live in cities, housing becomes more expensive. But there's two different processes at least going on here. I think there's actually more, but there's two that I will focus on here. One is that in a number of mostly global cities, the super rich are buying apartments that remain empty. The little clip we just saw with Simon and Pharrell is basically about that group of investors. These are mostly rich families who start corporations that they often register in tax havens, and with those corporations that are personal corporations owned by one person or by one family, they buy units often at the very high end of the market that often remain empty. And this is a quite specific problem, but it's a big problem in a city like London and a city like New York. On the other hand, we have globally active corporate landlords like Blackstone, that's the main culprit, you could say, in the movie, that are buying very large portfolios of housing. This is not necessarily the most expensive housing. Very often they're buying up affordable housing or moderately priced housing and trying to raise the rents on that type of housing. But rarely we're speaking of the most expensive housing in these cases. They ask what they can get for it in the market. So we saw in the movie in a place like New York, that's a lot of money. But they also buy housing in some declining East German cities where they try to raise the rent, but actually they're not really being able to because the market doesn't support much higher prices. So both stories are the same, but they're not. Both stories are important stories, but they're not the same. And both are only somewhat relevant in Belgium. These private landlords in Belgium are mostly smaller players. So we see a lot of small landlords in Belgium, and they are expanding a little bit, but it's almost exclusively small players. In selective parts of Brussels and a few other cities, we see slightly bigger landlords active, but some of the very big ones are not active in Brussels, and some of the medium large ones, when they're active in places like Brussels or a few other cities, they actually don't own a significant part of the private rental housing stock. Home ownership remains the main engine of inequality in Belgium, and I'll get back to that at the end. So a little bit more about these super rich buying properties. As Simon Varel was saying, this goes through corporations, but these are not these big corporations. These are these family-owned corporations. And I did a paper a number of years ago with Anna-Laure Hofman and Rodrigo Fernandez, and we looked in how they're buying properties. And here we show for London, the foreign-owned properties in the top end of the market are being bought through the British Virgin Islands, through the Isle of Man, through Panama, and a number of other jurisdictions that are generally known as tax havens. The Netherlands and Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland are also tax havens, but they actually don't show up here for very specific reasons. Other things happen through the Netherlands and Belgium. I'm not going to focus on that, but we see here in a way quite clear, because some of these countries only have a few thousand people. And if we see how many investments take place from these countries, it's very clear that we're dealing here with tax evasion. This is quite different from what we see the pension funds putting their money in organizations like Blackstone. And this has to do something which what economic geographer Gordon Clark from the UK calls pension fund capitalism. And surely this comes down to the idea that pension funds actually have a lot of money, and the amount of money that pension funds have and have to manage increases faster than the total amount of money, or it increases also faster than our economic growth, which means that each year they have to invest more money, which in a way is a good thing. It means money is being saved for pensions, but it means that they're constantly looking for new investments, and in a way they have more money flowing in than there's actually investments available. What does that mean? It means that a lot of it goes into driving up the prices. So that's very important. So this is a long-term perspective that started in the 1970s, and pension funds have become more important, not just in Europe. For instance, countries like Chile, lots of problems there, but they have a relatively large pension fund system for a global south country. And also some of that money is going into houses and housing. So this is a long-term perspective that's becoming more important over the years. The second trend here is a shorter-term perspective that has to do something with the financial crisis of 10, 15 years ago, and becomes now again more important also through COVID, which has to do with how investors respond to monetary policies. And I'll be very brief about this. One thing has to do with interest rates being very low, which means putting money in the bank is not that attractive. Putting it into real estate becomes more attractive. Also, putting your money in stocks can be quite risky, while putting your money in real estate, we can discuss if it's risky or not. But these pension funds, by and large, consider this not to be very risky if they invest in the right kind of market. And so a whole range of investors are doing this. And what we see, therefore, is what in terms of Keynesian economics is called a global pool of liquidity that is looking for a safe haven. We talk about this, and we see this in terms of the financialization of housing and real estate, more widely speaking. So the things that are discussed in the documentary are one example of this, but there are a number of other examples. And I'll illustrate this briefly with two figures. So these are a figure for Dutch institutional investors, so Dutch pension funds and Dutch insurance companies. The Netherlands is a relatively small country, but in terms of pension funds, the Netherlands is among the largest players in the world. The third largest pension fund in the world, included in the numbers here, is ABP, which is Dutch. So these are actually quite significant numbers. You don't need to look at the different colors in these beams, in these little charts. Just look at the years, and you see 82, 92, 2002, 2012. And basically what's happening here, every 10 years, the amount of money that the Dutch pension funds and insurance companies need to invest doubles, right? So of course, our economy doesn't double in those years. It grows if things go well with 3-4% a year, and in some years, like now, it may decline. So this means a lot of money is going in these pension funds and need to be going somewhere. And where is this money going? And again, don't need to look at all the charts and what they mean, but again, these are the same different 4 years, 10 years apart, each of them. And we see that the money, by and large, is going into the chart, into the bar with these little dots, which mean indirect investments into real estate by pension funds. What does it mean? In other terms, this is pension funds putting their money into real estate that they don't own directly, but through other funds, such as Blackstone or real estate investment trusts. So they invest through other vehicles in real estate. And what we basically see here is every 10 years, this amount of money is either increasing ×3 or ×4. So it's even increasing much faster than the amount of money that pension funds have to invest. The amount of money that goes into real estate, especially indirectly in real estate, is ballooning, basically. And this is one story behind the documentary. It's briefly discussed, the idea of pension funds. I think a Korean pension fund is mentioned. This is the story behind what is taking place there. we see, for instance, these real estate investment trusts. These are the biggest funds. Blackstone owns a few REITs, real estate investment trusts. But more importantly, Blackstone buys up a lot of housing that they then sell into real estate investment trusts. If you look at these blue bars here, you just see the number of these REITs goes up and down. We have for the US long-term data, and at some point they double, they go down again. There's a lot of stories to be told here, but then look at the purple line. What happens from the 70s till about the turn of the century is basically a minor increase of the amount of money going into real estate. What we see from the year 2000 onwards is a massive increase in the amount of money that goes into these funds, which corresponds, of course, very much with the picture we see here. This money has to go somewhere. This is where it's going. Then we see that the market down around 2006, so already a little bit before the global financial crisis. But then the interesting part is, of course, the picture, what happens to the line after 2008. So we're still in the midst of the financial crisis, the investments go up. By 2010, we have already surpassed the level of investments of the peak in 2005, and now it just goes up and up. Numbers since 2016 suggest the line is going up further, and we know that Blackstone was lining up money to invest during the COVID crisis, so this is only increasing further. These REITs are active throughout the world. This figure is about 10 years old. I would love to make a new one, but it's actually a lot of work. This one is one from ING, hence the orange color. But we basically see a lot of countries have either these REITs or they are introducing them. And the picture is now outdated. Many countries in the meantime have introduced REITs. This is being pushed by financial institutions in the world to get governments to change their regulation to introduce REITs. You can't just start a REIT, you need regulation to do so. So here one picture of what happens in Germany. And in the movie we see a lot of examples, for instance, from Toronto and a few other places. Some of the cities where organizations like Blackstone and REITs and other investors are most active is actually in Germany. The largest corporate landlord in the world, the largest landlord altogether in the world, is Vonovia. It's a German real estate investment trust. They own about 450,000 units, mostly in Germany, a few in some neighboring countries of Germany as well, but that's actually less than 50,000. Around 400,000 of them are in Germany. What I did here with a former PhD student of mine, Gert-Jan Wijberg, is we looked what happened with housing that used to be social housing. We cheat a little bit here by calling it public ownership. Some of it was publicly owned, some of it was owned by non-profits. So there were different models here in Germany. We start in 97, we see that all these big portfolios are owned socially. What happens from the late 90s onwards, a lot of German housing gets privatized. I'll skip the white organizations here. I'll focus briefly on the green ones. These are organizations like Blackstone. You see Blackstone also popping up here if you look at LAG Kiel. So that's the fourth example. Almost in the middle, you see Blackstone. We see other private equity funds and hedge funds buying up housing. But what is important here is that a lot of these organizations are only doing this for the medium term. They buy up the housing cheaply because it's being managed socially with low rents. Therefore, they're able to buy it up quite socially. Also, the housing being sold goes up to portfolios of 67,000 housing units at a time. So that means there's only maybe a dozen investors in the whole world who have the kind of money to buy this up. So this includes Blackstone, and Blackstone is a key player here. But you see Fortress, which is a hedge fund based in the UK. My cat is coming, which she usually does when she hears me talk to a screen. If you see a tail waving by, it's my cat. But these organizations only own the housing for a number of years, and then they resell them to organizations like real estate investment trusts who have a much more long-term interest. So the organization in green buy them at a low price and try to resell them at a high price. So they usually do that for a number of years. In the meantime, they try to make their portfolio more attractive. They try to raise the rents already. Sometimes they don't do much in management, sometimes because they're not experts in management, sometimes because they've never owned housing before. The organization in purple, on the other hand, they have a long-term interest to keep the housing. And they want to keep the housing because they see this as a good investment in the long term with a steady rate of return. So these are quite different organizations that are sometimes mixed. Sometimes it's also difficult because Blackstone, for instance, has its own REIT, which it then often sells off to other organizations. So they are different kind of organizations, but sometimes they're a little bit blurred in reality. We see that in Berlin also there's now a movement to renationalize some of this. There are two headlines that I took from websites. The first one is from 2019 in March, when there's a referendum that's being approved to renationalize some of the housing. The headline at the bottom is actually just from a few days ago, November 17th, last updated November 20th. And this shows some of the problems that exist when you want to do this, how difficult it actually is to renationalize this. I was interviewed also for the second piece, so you can see actually why I think it's difficult in that piece. We don't have time to discuss it now in detail. I need to get to the end of my presentations because I'm running out of time. So a little bit more about Belgian housing. As I already said, Belgium is quite different. There's not a lot of these big corporate landlords, and there's very little of this housing being bought by the super rich and that's staying empty. By and large, the story about Belgium is one about inequality in home ownership. The home ownership ideal, as many of you will know, in Belgium is widely spread and widely shared throughout political parties left and right. It hasn't always been that way, but it's been that way for quite a while. But housing prices have doubled in this century. More than doubled, depending a little bit on the place you look at. So when I say doubled, it's actually an underestimate. At the same time, the home ownership rate for the bottom 40%, so that's almost half of Belgians, the bottom 40% of incomes has actually decreased by 8 percentage points. So that means it's going down with 8% but I think this is between 2003 and 2017. So the same year, you see it in the next slide. So this is quite a markedly decrease in home ownership rates. The home ownership rate at large has only decreased a little bit because for richer households, the home ownership rate was already high, but has increased further. We see in those same years, 2003 to 2017, that the mortgage debt to GDP, so that's how big is the mortgages of all the Belgians together, compared to the size of the economy, has almost doubled from 30% to 55%. So all the mortgages of all Belgium together are now 55% of the Belgian economy in 1 year. So that's massive. The story in Belgium is often like, well, the mortgages aren't very risky, they're not very big. Also, we're not reselling these into international markets. Well, all these things are partially true. If you compare to the Netherlands and the UK, yes, the mortgage market in Belgium is smaller. Yes, it's less risky, but Belgium is catching up. Belgian mortgages are becoming riskier. Even reports of the National Bank, who's been pushing these developments themselves, admits that it's getting riskier. Also, although many Belgians, even people in the financial sector, seem to believe that Belgian mortgages are not being resold, about 25% of all Belgian mortgages are being resold. So we call it securitization for those of you who know the term. If you don't know the term securitization, forget about it again. But they're being resold to international investors. So this is also important. Belgium also has REITs. They're called gereglementeerde vastgoedvennootschap in Dutch, or Société Immobilière Réglementée in French. But these REITs barely invest in housing. Almost all of them invest in offices, to some extent also in retail, for instance, in malls are sometimes owned by these REITs. But they almost exclusively put their money in that kind of real estate, not in housing. So that's an important distinction here as well. I'm getting to the end of my talk now. This is the very last slides, and then I just have an end slide with the title again. So what's important here, that a lot of these practices are enabled by state acts. The deregulation of the housing that I discussed for the German case, this is made possible through regulation of the German state. The German state had to implement a law to make it possible for the housing to be privatized. Likewise, for REITs to exist in Belgium or in any other country, or securitization, this reselling of mortgages into financial markets, you need regulation. The story that's being told is often, we have deregulated the housing market, we have deregulated finance. Actually, this is not true. What we have done is we've regulated the market on behalf of large financial institutions and investors. So this is not deregulation. This is a very specific type of regulation that benefits a very specific type of actors. And this financialization of housing is driven by demand primarily for financial products rather than demand for housing. So not so much housing as a social good, but housing as a financial or economic good. And these practices tend to focus mostly on the existing housing stock. People sometimes say like, well, isn't it great? We need more houses. If there's new investors coming into the market, this means we get more housing and then the prices should drop. By and large, this is not what's happening. In most places, these large corporate landlords that are being discussed in the documentary buy up existing housing. There's some exceptions, and it's beginning to change in some places. For instance, in a place like Canada, that's being discussed also in the movie, some of these big investors are now active in building student housing, which they see as something very easily to financialize and something very easily to rent out, especially in places where there's shortage of housing and large numbers of students. So these are not necessarily big cities like Toronto, although Toronto is also one of them, but also college towns. So in a Belgian context, this would mean a focus on Brussels and Antwerp, but also Ghent and Leuven as student towns, and Louvain-la-Neuve, for instance, as well. So what is the main result of this, and this becomes very clear in the movie, is inflating, or in other words, rising rents, but also rising housing prices. I know I've spoken for a little bit too long. I'm going to end here. Thank you very much.
And normally there's an applause here, which allows this, the moderator to get back into the game with this.
Well, in the Netherlands, we say applausje voor jezelf. So I'll do it myself.
That's the only thing that you can manage in these kind of circumstances. It's impossible to collectively do an applause here. Thank you very much, Manuel. That was really insightful and also shows the real complexity, I think, of financialization. I think you can explain gentrification in just one slide, but financialization, that's clearly a little bit more complex. And so we come back to some of the issues, I think. It would be good to have a little bit more discussion on the state and what the state is doing here. So this idea of regulated deregulation, but let's first move to Anne and to ask her, what does the Belgian real estate actors make of this? Do they see this coming? Is this a topic of discussions? How do they perceive these evolutions? Where are they in these international developments? You probably have to turn on your microphone, Anne, before you talk.
Okay. I must say, first of all, that I'm very enthusiastic about the film, and to use the film for my students, both at university and in the management school, it will be most useful. And secondly, I can say that my analysis is quite the same as Manuel's. I can add some more things about Antwerp and things we see here. For instance, I just want to say I'm more into commercial real estate, and Manuel said it in one sentence at the end. What we don't see in the housing market, we see more and more in the retail, in the logistics sector, in the real estate for industry and so on. For instance, maybe for the students, to say the first pension fund that invested in Antwerp region was a Dutch pension fund that built the Weinigem shopping center that most of you know. So it's really, it came from space. In fact, it came from the Netherlands and it came into our area without any local mayor could have a voice in that. Also, another good example of financialization in the commercial sector that the students will know is the Brussels airport, for instance. The airport is bought by a hedge fund. And it was, in fact, 10 years ago, a bit an old-fashioned airport, and they just do what the financialization is. They make a super modern airport of it with a lot of offices and retail and so on, and then they sell it again. And in this way, they use our basic infrastructure of the country, where a lot of public money is invested in, to make new money and to go on. And there are a lot of, for Antwerp, I want to give maybe it's nice for the students to have an Antwerp example in the residential sector. You all know the new park in the north of the city, the Parkspoor Noord. And there you have a tower, and it's called the Light Tower. The Lichttoren. Well, there is one tower in Antwerp where there is never light, and it's the Light Tower. And it's a good example of local financialization. It's not the big groups anymore who have their money in it, because they sold it, I heard, mainly to a group of medical people who all had too much money on the bank, and that money on the bank, that doesn't work very well for them. So they said, well, they're building a new hospital not far away from there. Let's invest together in the service flats and in the flats of that tower. But they were not able to find people to live in that tower. So now their money is making far more less than it would have done in the bank. So
let's stick to the, can I just interrupt about the empty apartments, because that's an intriguing thing. And I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about from you, Anna, from Manuel, or from Frederik, is he still watching? How exactly do you make money of empty apartments? I mean, it really...
No, they are losing money.
Okay, but that's a different case then.
They hoped, well, it's not always working. But it illustrates how the big money is putting the risk to small ownership. And this is not a really small ownership. These are like the parents of the students in your room. They have some money on the bank and they say, oh, let's invest it in a safe way in real estate. We buy some service flats. And so the risk is gone from the big groups to the small owners. And that's really something we see a lot in Belgium. Also in the new project in the New South, New Zuid in Antwerp, there are, the projects with the big buildings. And well, there are quite some people who just invested. And the big groups, they say, you buy an apartment, a flat, and then you will have a renter and you will have a lot of money. But lots of these apartments who are for the really rich people, well, the rich people, they have their own home ownership, so they don't need those flats. So there is not so a big market for those flats, and a lot of them are empty. So,
but now you're talking about failed investments, and somebody is picking up the ticket here. Maybe Manuel, can you explain? Are there people making money off empty apartments? How exactly does that work?
There are people who make money in it. There's indeed, as Anne says, also people who don't. So what I can tell from the examples that we looked at in London and New York, one thing that some investors do is by using these tax havens, it's very difficult even for them to be charged property taxes, for instance. So that is one thing. It's about parking money. Sometimes it's also used for laundry money. So then, in a way, you don't need to have a lot of money. You can lose some money as long as it's not too much. For some people, it's also important to buy a property somewhere else in case they need to flat a certain political regime. So in Miami, you have plenty of empty apartments that are being bought mostly by rich people from Latin America, that if necessary, they can flat their place. You find the same in Vancouver for Chinese people, for instance. In London and New York, you find this mixed with all kinds of other investments. There are also people who think, okay, I'm not planning to rent it out now, but maybe in the future I can sell the apartments. And there's this belief that housing prices always do go up. And in the long term, housing prices do tend to go up. So you don't need to necessarily make money on it through the rent. If you do want to make money on it, and as I said, not everyone needs to make money on it, this can also happen in the long term. This is also why one of the reasons that housing and real estate, more widely speaking, is such an interesting investment, because you can make money by renting it out, and you can make money by reselling it again. Just imagine that I'm trying to do the same with my laptop that's now 5 years old. I can barely use it anymore. If I want to sell it now, it's worth, maybe 30 euros. So try to do it with a laptop. As soon as you walk out with your laptop of the shop, the value halves. The same is true for cars. So, and these are still, you could say, big capital investments, relatively speaking. With a house, however, you walk out of the real estate agent, you walk out of the notary, and your house is still worth the same. And 10 years down the line, likely your house is worth more. Maybe there's going to be a crisis at some point, but in the long term, the housing prices tend to increase. So for many people, this is also, who buy these apartments that are empty, it's often a more long-term investment with the idea in the future I will benefit from it. Even if I can't rent it out now, even if housing prices go down now, if I can hold it long enough, I'll be out of trouble.
Mm-hmm. But then I just wanted to say in Belgium, there are not so much people who own real estate that can have these empty things. And then you see, of course, that also Airbnb is coming in, students are coming in, and so on. So they look for alternative renting then in that case. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Frederick want to say something.
No, I was about to talk about the same thing, and thank you, Manuel, and thank you for very, very interesting knowledge that you bring on. I mean, what I understand from Saskia Sassen and all the other people I meet is that, I mean, when people enter into homes in London, like the people where the house where we visit with all the squatters in London, it was owned by a Qatari general, been standing there for 20 years, empty. It was like very small space. It was 3 blocks away from Buckingham Palace. So why is that so expensive? What is the value of that house just standing empty for 20 years? And I think that also, Saviano also explains that it's a way of getting into the jurisdiction of the UK. And when you're inside, you have this house as an asset for you can go to the bank with that asset and get more money. So it's actually a way of moving into a country to have these houses, even if you never stay there. I mean, of course, the housing market is not one thing, it's many different things at the same time. So of course, there are many details, many different reasons. But the dark towers, I've seen them all over the world. And many of them in Germany, but also in Southeast Asia, if you go to Bangkok, for example, but also if you go to Cyprus, if you go to other, where you have the golden visas, there's a lot of dark towers also. So it's basically, and I think the criminal money is not so well researched, but I think somebody should really dive into the criminal money, because I think it's playing a big role. And of course, it depends on how you define criminal money. But if you think money stolen from the people of many countries, you will see it play quite a big role.
I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. I think the empty apartments or the empty housing is quite a powerful symbol of everything that is wrong, I think, with the current housing markets. And I think it's a powerful symbol. The fact that it's so hard to understand and so hard to explain what's happening here I think makes it very powerful. Thank you, Manuel and Anne. We'll come back to you in the next section. But let's finish, not finish, because we still have quite a few things to discuss. But let's move to the last section, which is hopefully going to be a little bit more optimistic. At least give us a perspective of how we can change this, or how we can turn this to the better. So we're moving on to Line Algoed. She's a PhD researcher at the Free University of Brussels, and she's also a teaching assistant there in Cosmopolis, which are colleagues, urban scholars at the Free University of Brussels. She's also a research fellow at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. And she's also the director of the Center for CLT Innovation, Center for Innovation in Community Land Trust. And this is what she's going to talk about. She's been involved, amongst others, in Latin America, in Puerto Rico, if I understand well, in land struggles, supporting people and researching people that are involved in land struggles. And she just has a book which she co-edited or co-authored about collective community land trusts, some international perspective, and this is what she's going to talk about the next 15 minutes. But before we move on to the presentation of Line, there's a slight delay in the streaming of the presentation. So if people want to ask questions, because of course, after Line's presentation discussion, we'll move on to some questions from the audience. Please feel free to put them in the chat function under Facebook Live, and so we're going to pick up some of these questions afterwards. But please, Line, it's all yours now.
Thank you so much, Stan. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Stan and Jan, for inviting me today. Thank you also, Manuel and Anne. That was really, really interesting. And especially thank you, Frederick, for this fantastic film. I'm really happy to discuss this film. I really think that it's just set in motion so many things, what Leilani said, like it really has mobilized people. And I also really agree with what they say in the film, like we need to know this language. We need to know what securitization means. We need to know how financialization works, how our cities really work. I really believe in this like sort of public education, like we really, especially since 2007, we need to know what is going on, and this film really helps. So today I would like to, I just have to see, yeah. Today I would like to bring a very specific example of a group of people who have come together to raise up, to stand up against this financialization of land and housing, to really protect their rights to remain in the city, their right to the city, their right to stay put in the neighborhood where they live. So I'd really like to go deeper into how communities are doing that, how they're fighting back, because the people who live there, the people who feel this threat every day, they know what's going on. And I really think that these knowledges can really help us as well to make sense of what's going on and to start changing things. And Sten, I just wanted to say one thing, like, please do raise your hand if my internet is struggling, because I've had some struggles. So I might be just talking and I might be like invisibilized. In any case, let's see. So I'll be talking today about the Caño Martín Peña Community Land Trust, as Sten said. I'll first briefly present how this community land trust works. And then I'll go a bit further, a bit deeper into how CLTs in general work and how they are going against this financialization of land, financialization of housing, which the film addresses. So this community land trust, the Caño Martín Peña Community Land Trust, is the result of the work of thousands of residents living in 7 communities along a channel in the center of San Juan, Puerto Rico. So you can see the channel on this picture. These are communities that were originally established informally, so without legal ownership of the land. And the residents here have created what is the first community land trust in Latin America and the Caribbean, but it's also one of the first 2 community land trusts worldwide in an informal settlement. So, and I'll explain this later, and I'm sure many of you will know, but in a nutshell, a CLT is an instrument that separates home ownership from land ownership. So in a CLT, homes are individually owned by families, by households, by individuals, but the land is owned collectively. And this land can never be sold. It's always in the hands of a certain community. And so the community land trust allows residents to stop speculation with the land, to stop gentrification, and it is actually something that is very much occurring here. And therefore, they are able to stay put and to still live in living. So just very quickly to situate where we are, Puerto Rico is in unincorporated US territory, an island in the Caribbean. It's unincorporated, meaning it's not a US state. Puerto Ricans cannot vote for US president, but Puerto Ricans do have US citizenship. So I'll say a word or two about Puerto Rican history, very similar to many other places in the world. In the 1930s, 1940s, Puerto Rico went through a very rapid industrialization process, which really pushed impoverished farmers out of their rural lands, and they were forced to leave their rural areas. Many of those people migrated to the USA remember they have US citizenship, so they went to the US, many of them to work as cheap labor. But those who couldn't afford, or those who didn't want to leave the island, they went to the island's coastal cities, and they had to go there to find work. There was no affordable housing available, very few public housing available. So they started building settlements in the most inaccessible lands in the cities, meaning very close to the sea, on very steep hills, or on swamplands next to rivers or waterways. And so many of these families, they settled on the swamplands around a waterway, or a caño in Puerto Rican Spanish, on the fringes of the city at that moment. And so this was the Martín Peña waterway, the Caño Martín Peña. Establish what we now refer to as the Caño communities. So that's how we'll be calling them. So several governments over the years tried to eradicate these areas. Puerto Rico is getting rid of its slums, the official government slogan was. And so several parts of the Caño communities were cleared, people were evicted. And as you can see on this photo, gradually the city started arriving to where the Caño communities were located, and the land became valuable. After evicting large segments of these communities, the central business district established itself there. So several headquarters of the banks and so on, they established themselves where the land was cleared. And so indeed, as Saskia Sassen says in the film, everywhere there is this massive buying of rural land. People have to leave their rural areas and they have to come to the city. And urban land is starting to become precious land. You very much see this in the case of the Caño communities. For some reason, there you go. So today, still about 26,000 people are living in these areas, in these communities. The area is now urbanized, there is electricity, yet most of the area still lacks a proper and adequate sewage system. And so wastewater goes directly into the Martin Peña channel. And this, over the years, has polluted the channel so badly that it is completely blocked now. And I just learned today that actually 1 in 5 homes in the US are not connected to a proper municipal sewage system. So the problem is very, very widespread. It's 20% of all US homes. So this is quite something. So in the early 2000s then, so basically what happens with the channel so blocked is that when it rains, and it rains very often in Puerto Rico, that communities, large parts of the Caño communities get flooded. And so in the early 2000s, people started saying, we have enough of this. We need to improve our living circumstances. And they started demanding the restoration of the waterway and the installation of a proper sewage system, like in other parts of the city. And so they started holding community meetings. Over 700 meetings were held over 2 years, in which residents really started talking about their distrust in government, about especially their fear of displacement, because they knew that the restoration of this waterway would drastically increase the land price, the price of the land. Residents, remember, still did not have formal ownership of the land that by now they had been living on for several decades. So residents, after all these meetings, they decided that they needed to create a mechanism that would allow them to remain in their community, to stay put, to stay where they are, while benefiting from the improvements of the infrastructure, which would be the dredging, or the dragado, as they say, the dredging of the waterway. So they jointly created what is a comprehensive development plan, which was later formally adopted by the Puerto Rico Planning Board. Professionals like urban planners, architects, engineers, social workers, they helped the residents in making this plan, but it really was the residents themselves who came up with the ideas. And so to implement the development plan, the residents created several institutions. One of them is the Community Land Trust, or the Fideicomiso de la Tierra del Caño Martín Peña, as they call it. So what is this Fideicomiso de la Tierra? So the residents there, they decided to use an idea that was used mostly in the USA, the Community Land Trust. It's been around for quite a few decades now. But the residents here in the Caño communities, they didn't just copy-paste the model on a very different reality that they were living. No, they decided to completely dismantle it and adapt the instrument to their own needs, because they lived on land that they did not legally own. So as we can see on this slide, each family in the Caño individually owns their home. Each household individually owns their home. But the community collectively owns the 200 acres of land on which their homes are located. So the land can never be sold, ever. So each family also owns surface rights, so the right to use the surface, which they can sell, inherit, or mortgage. And they will get a deed that is then officially registered with the property registry. So through this instrument, they are formalizing their ownership. The Caño Martín Peña Community Land Trust now regularizes the land tenure for approximately 1,500 families. So together, they have now become one of the biggest landowners in San Juan. And as we know, those who own land have power. So thousands of residents, and this is really the importance of this project, thousands of residents historically marginalized, have really taken that power in their own hands. Because we know land is wealth, land is power, land is control. So very quickly on how do CLTs actually work? I'd like to zoom out a little bit now. Title to multiple parcels of land, either scattered around an area or continuous, is held by a non-profit corporation, which is the CLT. Those lands are never resold, they're removed permanently from the market, and they are managed on behalf of a place-based community. So homeowners, as I said, individually own their home. And when these homes or that unit is resold, it's resold by a limited resale price. And the non-profit landowner, which is the CLT, has membership that is open to anyone living within its service area. And then the governing board of this CLT, of this organization, is elected by this membership. And that membership is represents three groups, usually. So that's people living on CLT lands. Second group, residents of the CLT service area who do not live on the CLT's lands. And then thirdly, people who represent the public interest. Sometimes I can't pass my slide. I don't know what that is. There you go. So why is this a good idea? I wanted to talk a little bit about that, especially in the light of the housing crisis that is described so brilliantly in this film. When house prices increase much faster than household income, which the film talks about, which Manuel also talked about, which is the case in many cities around the world, 90%, something like that, surely. In the north and in the south, it's happening everywhere. So the affordability gap then widens. People, have less income and housing prices go up. So if governments want to do something about the right to advocate housing, because that is a human right, and certain governments really do want to do something, they would require an ever larger subsidy to keep a home affordable. So that is the red on this graph. So programs providing loans or grants or subsidies for housing, right, to home buyers, they must constantly increase the level of subsidy to keep pace, right, in pace with the growing gap. So as I said, the CLT limits the rate of increase in resale price. And that figure is really set, and it's also decided by the community, how they are going to limit the resale price. So if governments decide to give a one-time subsidy in a CLT home to lower the initial sale price to an affordable level, so that is that red again, that decreases, the CLT then limits the rate of increase in the resale price. So this helps to keep homes affordable perpetually. So here's a slide with where CLTs are happening currently at this moment. You see there's a lot of them in Europe. We would have to zoom in to show you that actually there's also several happening in Belgium right now. You can find more information, I'm just going to say this, on the Center for CLT Innovation, of course. And I quickly wanted to mention that a CLT is right now being established in Leuven. So also indeed, because of what we talked about, Leuven's affordability gap that is constantly widening, they are trying to do something about this. So one of my last slides is just, why does this matter? Of course, there are many more reasons why this matters than just the ones that I can fit into one slide here. But in a nutshell, because we need to recognize that the world is being changed, not only by people working for the UN, like Leilani, very important the work that she does, but also by all of those people living in these realities of displacements. So these people are staying put, they're staying where they are, despite the bullying. And this has been mentioned by several of the people in the film, and I think that's such an important point, because the bullying is real, the exhaustion is real. It's a lot of mechanism trying to exhaust these people for them to leave their homes or their lands. So these people are staying put. There are people on Caribbean islands, for example, where lands are being bought up by foreign investors. Caribbean islands are very often mentioned in these stories as well. British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, you know, the Bahamas, like all of these places are very important places in what is going on. But like people are staying put. There's very many places where people say like, we are not moving. But also people in favelas in Brazil, for example, or in other informal settlements across the world, but also people in Palestine, you know, people are staying put, people in other settler colonies where they're trying to be displaced, but people are staying, and we need to learn from them because they have knowledges that can help us. And so I think there's a lot of lessons from CLTs like the Caño CLT for CLTs worldwide, but also for other organizations. In these projects, they're really trying to move away from community participation, so community participating in a project, to really community-led projects. So it's the communities that are leading. Professionals help, but they take a step back. It's the community leading and not the professionals. And that doesn't happen very often yet. And I think that this applies to institutions around the world, universities, companies, government organizations, etc., etc. Decisions that are taken above the head of those who will be affected by the decisions, they will be less effective. Nothing for us without us, as this participant's t-shirt says in one of the many exchanges that we've organized with the Caño communities, bringing other communities that are also involved in land struggles together to share experiences, to share mechanisms, and to share hope and inspiration. Just one final slide to show that the Caño communities won the World Habitat Award, which was awarded, which was granted to them in the Habitat 3 conference of the UN in Quito in 2016. And the photo below shows Leilani Farha handing over this award to the Caño communities, which was a very important moment for the communities. So that's for me so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Lini. That was a really inspiring and hopeful picture of what could go different in housing. So let's bring these two perspectives together. We had a heavy perspective on financialization of housing, which is steamrolling across the world. And then we have this hopeful picture of people trying to fight back, trying to maintain their control over the land, which really is, I mean, there's this wonderful quote of in one of the classics of urban studies. I think it's John Logan, and when he's writing about the urban growth machine, and he's talking about urban life, and he says urban life is trying to make a life on a commodity. And I think that really sums it up very well and sums up all the challenges that go with that. But let me ask to Anna, Frederick, or Manuel, whoever wants to ask, if you hear this story about community land trust and which is a story which is spreading around the world nowadays at a pretty fast pace, what difference does it make? What difference can it make? Whoever wants to, Frederick, yes?
I mean, I love Lina's final word, you know, that people have to stay put. You know, it's, I mean, there is what we see, I mean, we show it from Kensington, Notting Hill in London, you know. Who the fuck is he to say that I can't stay in my community? You know, it's like, this is what's happening everywhere, that people are pushed out. People who actually create the story of the cities. And I think there is a lot of power in the history of our cities. And when a community says we're not going to go anywhere, it's extremely important. And it's also very inspirational. And that there is now a model for how to do this is even better. And you can see on your map that this is actually spreading from city to city, from country to country. So that's what we need. We need inspirational stories and people who are stating exactly what you said here. So inspirational, cool.
Manuel, what do you think?
I can add to that a little bit. Yeah, I think it's an important example of one of the many solutions we can have for more affordable housing. What I shy away from, I'm not saying that Nina is doing that, but what sometimes happens in discussion that one model is being pushed very much at the expense of other ones. There are mutual housing associations, we have limited equity cooperatives, we have tenant associations, and we still have social housing as well. And I think the best solution is actually to have all of these solutions. I think another great solution is actually to legalize squatting. Not because I think squatting is such a great solution for housing. I think squatting is a great solution because it forces landlords not to keep their properties empty. If you have a squatting law that says after 6 months a unit is empty, or a year, but I think shorter is better, you're allowed to squat a building if they're not renovating it. If you can show you're renovating it, fine, no problem. But if you're not doing anything on the building, you can squat it. It's actually a stick with which, as a legal system, you can say is not good to keep a property empty. I think for most people, squatting is not a very ideal solution, but I do think it can help to have fewer units empty. So I think all these solutions together, including the community land trust, but also state-offered housing and state-sponsored housing, I think are important to fight the battle of lack of good housing at good prices.
Maybe over to you from your experience with the discussions which you have with students in the Master of Real Estate. Is this something that is on their radar? Do they look at cooperatives? Do they look at alternative ways of governing property? Is it something that they look at, or is it completely marginal in their worldview and their look at real estate? You will have to put on your microphone. Always important.
Well, on the contrary, Stan, well, the students I meet in the Master of Real Estate, they are interested students, and they want to learn more, and they come to a management school to learn about innovative things. And maybe this is a special group that I meet most. And in our program, we have 4 pillars. We have a pillar on the real estate markets and the location. And well, there I teach myself a lot. And for instance, I teach about financialization as the context for the markets for more than 10 years. And we go on a field trip to London, where the financialization is the topic. We visit there. I don't know if the other ones know that project, the Coin Street Builders on the South Bank in London. It's also a very nice project on how you can go against those financialization things. So they learn about it in the program, and I must admit that some students all at once realize that they are playing in that game, and but there are other students who heard already about financialization, because they can only come into the program when they have 3 to 5 years of experience in the sector. And then we have a pillar of the legal context. And well, one of the most important things we teach there is how you can use innovative legal contracts to go against the business as usual. So they come to the program to learn about that. Most of the students know already a lot about the 3rd pillar. That's the financial one. But they are always very looking to new things. And I must say that the students we have, they are not the normal kind of real estate people you think about. In fact, there is a very high level of ethical feeling amongst our students. But maybe, of course, they are only a small group of the whole real estate community. And but after 25 years, we have more than 1,000 students that are now alumni of our program. And when I look at what they are doing, they have a real estate society, and they have a lot of private activities. You can go to their website, Real Estate Society. And if you look at the program for the last year, all the things they do, they are really going into the direction of sustainability. And about 20 years ago, it was about architectural quality. And 15 years ago, it was about engineering, sustainable engineering. And 10 years ago or 5 years ago, about ecology. And now since a few years, it's all about social inclusion. So they really are busy with that kind of things. And when you look at their prices now, they are just giving prices to good real estate projects. It's now on LinkedIn. You can follow what projects get the prices. Well, there are always projects with that social dimension that are the last years chosen for a prize, together with the ecological things. Also, the ecological things they like a lot. So if I look at my students, they are maybe a little bit exceptional, but they are really busy with that kind of things. But I have to say, in the residential market, the residential real estate people, that's very fragmented in Belgium, in Flanders. And that's nearly amateuristic. People with families with some money, and well, they go for, they start a real estate company, a small thing, and there you have, it's more amateuristic, and they don't bother about those things. And of course, you have the very big boys who are mainly in Brussels, if they are in Brussels at all, and this stays still a very intransparent world that that does not look outside of their bubble in Belgium. I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your insight, Fjord. Perhaps we are lucky to be amateurs in Belgium, and because maybe we get shielded from some of the worst things in the housing market. I'm conscious we are edging towards the end of the program today, but let's take some questions for the audience. Maybe continue for another 10 minutes if you allow us, and to take some questions from the audience. In order to treat all the questions of some of the questions we had, maybe just one answer for each question. There's a Sander, for example, who's asking the question. I mean, it's clearly that the empty apartments are on people's minds, and people are trying to sort of understand what's going on there. So Sander asked, what would happen if there would be a sudden massive sell-off of these apartments? Is it possible that this happens, that at some point in time the market just crashes and everybody throws his property on the market? What would happen? Is that invisible? Is that imaginable that this would happen? And Xenia also asked for, what kind of short-term solutions are there for these empty apartments? What could we do about it? So maybe just one answer to that, whoever wants to. Frederick?
I can't speak to the corrupt buildings and so on, but it's obviously that the touristification, the Airbnb apartments, is something that is shaking the cities right now all over the world. So you can see in London, in Paris, in Barcelona, and on and on and on, a lot of apartments are going back to the market, to the rental market. Even cities like Lisbon are buying back apartments, and Spain are also special legislations. So there is some kind of shift going on where the cities take the advantage of a weakened short-term rental market and to actually win back lost terrain in some way. So that is happening, but it doesn't really explain where the most wealthy people make with their money. It's because it's a lot of the short-term rental is also smaller businesses. It's not only because it's always a big mix of everything. But that's my short answer.
Maybe Manuel, on is it possible that at some point in time, for whatever reason, all this property ends up on the market and we have a big crash?
I think Frederick is right. Like, this is particularly a problem for empty Airbnbs and empty homestays and these kind of activities. Airbnb is not the only player. More and more properties are also being let out through booking.com. And I think there is a real problem, because here you have landlords that are dependent on the income. And there's not enough income coming in. So they may be forced to sell at some point. Usually there's an idea like, well, once the crisis comes, people will be forced to sell and then the prices drop. Very often it doesn't happen. Very often when more units come to the market, the prices don't necessarily drop. If we see Spain, yes, the prices dropped at some point, but when actually was the largest increase of housing on the housing market in Spain was in the years in the run-up to the crisis. Spain was building more than France, Germany, and the UK combined, even though there's a smaller population in each of these countries individually. And the housing prices went up more in Spain than any of the other countries. Ireland also heavily overbuilt, prices went up a lot. So it doesn't necessarily mean prices will go down, but I think these Airbnb properties may be concentrated in very specific markets where they can have an impact. which would be a corrective to the market because it's the same places where the housing prices, very specifically in the rents within those cities, have gone up. If we talk about these units that are purposely left empty by very rich people, well, there won't be this effect. They don't need to sell. They will only sell if they feel like selling. There's no reason for them to sell for any other reason. So there's not going to be a massive on the market of these units. To get to the other part of the question about the solutions, well, the example I mentioned before about legalizing squatting, not because squatting is so great, but because it fights vacancy, is one thing to think about this. One other thing is to adapt other kinds of laws that make it more difficult to keep housing empty. But it's very difficult to do something about it if you don't have two instruments to fight them, which is the great thing about squatting. As a government, you don't need to do anything about it. You just need to legalize it. And then other actors will take care of it for you. It's a very cheap solution for the government as well.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully some politicians are listening, because Belgium has moving into the other direction over the past couple of years in terms of its squatting laws. This brings us neatly to questions about the state and the government. And I think there were a couple of questions. One from Kelly, who says, we're talking about the people here in the community land trust, and we talked about the global financial investors, so the private market side of things, but where is the state, and what can the state do? Doesn't the state have a crucial role in leveraging power to change this? And then there was a more specific question from Uli, which is directed at Line, which is wondering, if you want to set up a community land trust, don't you need a government turning over the land to you? From a lot of cases in Western Europe, it's often the government who actually provides the land to start with. So who's going to take these questions?
Yeah, I can say something
Leilani?
about
Yes.
that. Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really important question, and indeed it would have been very nice to have somebody from governments here. I know that maybe somebody from Leuven might have joined, or because there are a lot of governments really looking at like, what can we do? For example, people like Ada Colau, which I'm very happy she was in the film as well, the mayor of Barcelona. And yeah, absolutely, you need these good partnerships with governments. In Puerto Rico, this has always been quite difficult because of the way that Puerto Rico works. Of course, like there's a lot of obstacles from governments. They have other plans for the island, which we have seen as well when the governor was ousted last summer, because he clearly had other plans for the island. They were jokingly saying in a chat that came out that they wanted Puerto Rico to be freed of Puerto Ricans. They wanted Puerto Ricans to leave so that their wealthy people could come in and take over this tropical island. But it has worked. Government has played a very important role in the community land trust in Puerto Rico, in San Juan, which is really something I should have talked a bit more about. Didn't have time. But it also really depended on several government employees that really said, like, let's take community participation to another level. They were allowed to go into the communities, to go and ask what the community thought of an infrastructure project, but they really took this to another level. They really said, we're not just going to consult, we are really going to let these people lead these projects that we're going to do, and we're going to use government funds for it. But of course, that is not always the case, but there's still many other ways to get hold of lands. For example, in Brazil, they might be looking at like a private transfer of lands, like from a hotel, for example, on a parking lot where people have been living for several decades. They're looking at private alliances with the private sector. If the government is not on your side, there still are other ways to go around it. And I think, again, like these knowledges of how people have exactly done that really works. In Belgium, I would say, like, for example, the CLT in Leuven is really the community land trust there is really, it's the government, the local government looking at what they can do. So there they're playing an extremely important role in making this happen. And that will be the case, for example, as well in Burlington. One of the biggest CLTs in the world is in Burlington, where Bernie Sanders was mayor at the time when the community land trust started there. So yes, government is also a very important partner because they're still involved in the governing board of a community land trust, as I explained as well. So.
Thank you very much for this answer, Lina. I think Manuel would like to come in on this question? At least he's
Yeah.
sharing his screen, so I guess he wants to
Is
say
my
something.
mic on? Because I can't see that right now.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
your mic is on. I can hear you.
So this is actually a slide that I made for Leilani when she asked me to come to Geneva and present to the UN. So these are the lessons that I gave. These are the lessons that I suggested their government institutions could do. So I already mentioned a few of them. Number one was basically in my conclusion. And number 5 I've just mentioned. But there's all kinds of other things you can do. There's all kinds of regulation possible. And you don't need to regulate on behalf of large players. You don't need to be regulating on behalf of financial institutions. You can regulate on behalf of other people. So this is not about more regulation or less regulation. It's about a different kind of regulation that we need. You can regulate mortgage loans. You can regulate rental prices. One of the reasons things in Berlin went out of hand because the regulation of the rental prices was changed. It's not deregulated, but changed. You can limit monopolies. Some of the things we see in the movie have to do with Blackstone and other actors buying a lot of properties in one specific place. This is in Belgium less of a problem, I would say. In some other places, this can be a big problem. You can limit this, just like you say to other companies, you can't have the whole market. This is not how capitalism works. So this is not a socialist solution. In this sense, this is a capitalist solution. Let's say, let's have capitalism work with more actors. So this is something that could also appeal, for instance, to right-wing parties. Then, I mean, number 6, I've basically mentioned before when I was asked about the CLTs. There's a whole range of solutions. The 7th one is one that urban planners will like. Well, you can use your land use and zoning powers. You can use them also to regulate for affordable housing. You can say, even without putting any money up there, that at least 30% or 40% or 50% of the housing should be affordable housing. We can discuss what affordable housing is, how expensive it should be, how cheap it should be. I mean, those are in a way our technical discussions, but a lot of local governments don't use this power where they could do so. So there's a whole range of solutions, and even just implementing 2 or 3 of these things would already make a massive difference. If you implement all 7 of them, I think we would not see a movie, we won't see a follow-up to Push. So that will be the greatest if we won't see a follow-up, and I'm afraid we will see a follow-up to Push. Because a lot of these things won't happen. But if the movie is really successful, Frederick is successful, then there won't be any follow-ups anymore. So I hope that he will become useless and people see the movie in 20 years and they wonder why this silly movie was made. But I'm afraid it won't happen and people will need to keep seeing it. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Manuel. And thank you, Line, Anne, Manuel, and Frederick to be with us. I think we made a good attempt to replace the category of gentrification with financialization, or at least supplement it with the category of financialization. If people aren't convinced after this half an hour of talk or 1 hour and a half of talk, they will probably never be convinced. So we did a good job, I think, to convince people of the value of looking to the housing market by focusing on financialization. And we also had a look at alternatives. I want to thank all of you for sharing these insights and stories with us. I want to thank the audience of being here at an evening so late to discuss this kind of quite heavy topics. And I want to thank, of course, also the people from Stadsforum, Jan and his group to make this all happening. It's not easy. I've been looking at different streams at the same time, so it's quite a complex thing to manage this through a Zoom call and Facebook streaming. But I think it went well. So thank you all for being present here. But before we leave, there is some final words from Jan and his team at Stadsforum. So they will take over from now. Thank you for listening.
Oh yeah, well, thank you all, also from the technicians here at Stadsforum in Antwerp. We were very impressed by all the talks and the discussions. So thank you all, and Stan, you did a great job moderating.
Okay, I'm not sure whether they are finding the mic. Jan, are you there?
Yes. You don't hear me now?
So, let me just take over. It's going to be easier. I think what we see on the screen now is just some events which are coming up tomorrow already. So we could busy program this week. We have the book launch of Zwerfruimte, the Wonder Space. It's about well, I don't know what it's about, so I'm not going to talk about. But it's you can check this out. This is an event with, amongst others, the building master, the building architect of Flanders, with Tine Hens, who's a journalist who's writing a lot about issues on open space and ecological vision on spatial planning. So they will be discussing this tomorrow in the same place on Facebook Live. And watch out for the Facebook page and the website of Stadsforum .be, because there will be many more events in the coming months to come. So have a good evening, everybody, and thank you for watching and listening and participating. We'll see you back soon, hopefully. Bye.
We do an after talk of the after talk.
We can, but we first must make sure that the live stream is off. It's no longer on. Not that you want to gossip, of course, but